Last week, between the holidays, I had a chance to talk to my friend who lives in Prague in the Czech Republic. And I was reflecting that a few years ago, I guess it's maybe now been like 6 years, Megan and I spent New Year's in Prague with my friend. And of course, we were talking about hoping to be able to travel there again and see him and his new girlfriend. But that may not happen right away. And as I reflected on that trip to Prague for New Year's, that reminded me of another trip that we had taken. Megan and I, on our honeymoon, went to visit friends in Europe and stopped over in Prague. I was planning on staying at my friend's house, which may seem like a strange thing for a honeymoon, but I'm cheap. My friend picked us up at the airport and got us a taxi and then directed the taxi. And I've been to Prague enough times that at some point I knew that we were not headed toward his flat. And I started to ask questions, and he said, I wanted to show you something before we go back to the house. Okay. We end up pulling up to a monastery that has been converted into a hotel. And I'm wondering really what's happening at this point. We go in. He says, there are parts of the monastery that are just open. I want to show it to you. We go in. He takes us to the front desk, and it turns out that he and some of my other friends in Prague that I've met over the years had wanted to give us a gift for our honeymoon, and so they got us a hotel room in that hotel. This is the kind of hospitality that I have received when traveling abroad, the ways that people go above and beyond to be kind to a foreigner. I have friends that live in Hungary as well, and I think I've told this story before, but Megan and I were traveling to Hungary once to visit our friends there. They had traditionally met us in Budapest, which is the largest city, and then taken us by car to the smaller town where they live. But we felt confident that we had been to Hungary a couple of times, and we could use the trains to get to their hometown. And so we told them that we were going to do that. And we found our train, and we got on our train. But what we did not expect is that in the midst of traveling, suddenly, in the middle of the countryside, the train stopped. Can you turn this one on? It sounds like we're having trouble with that mic. And it turned out that we suddenly were lost because a person came walking through the train, speaking in Hungarian, which we don't speak. And we then progressed very slowly forward to the next station, and everyone got off of the train. All we could figure out was that something clearly had happened with the train because we stopped and then we only traveled slowly. There must have been some sort of mechanical issue. What we knew is that this train would get us where we needed to go, but we were now in some other small town and we didn't know what train would get us where we needed to go. Eventually, we kept hopping on trains and we ended up in a semi-large city where we found a customer service person who spoke English and was able to help us get on the right train. At some point, my friend's family discovered that this train had gone out of commission, and they're suddenly very worried for their American friends. And when we finally did arrive 4 hours late in the town where we were supposed to be, we found out that my friend's family had been calling every train station in the area along that route, asking if they had seen a couple of lost Americans. This is the kind of hospitality that I have experienced as a foreigner in another land. And so I understand Ruth's question today. She says to Boaz, "Why have I found such favor that you see me, someone who is a foreigner?" You see, while I have friendships in other countries that has lent itself to that kind of hospitality, in Ruth's world, she shouldn't be noticed. Not only is she a foreigner, and in the Israelite society, while you're supposed to offer a certain amount of kindness and hospitality to foreigners, there is a greater obligation to your own people, and I think that we traditionally would feel that way as well. But not only is she a foreigner, but she's a woman, and she's a widow, and so she really is nothing in this society. What she needs, according to Israelite rules, is a redeemer. What that is when a woman lost her husband, she really had nothing because the household and all of that would have been in her husband's realm, basically. And specifically, Ruth loses her sons as well, and that would be who your first redeemer would be, is if your husband died, then one of your sons would normally take you in and care for you. But she doesn't have any sons anymore. And if you know the rest of Ruth, her mother-in-law, Naomi, tells her that she should go find another husband, because this was sometimes an opportunity. Women might be able to convince some other man to marry them, although, again, this was very hard to do because of the way society worked. Israel did have a system for figuring out who the next of kin was, and someone was supposed to redeem you, though. Boaz is related to Ruth, but he's not her redeemer. There's another person. And so if you continue reading in Ruth, you'll find out that Boaz ends up going to this other person and asking him if he wants to redeem Ruth, and says, if you're not going to, I will. And Boaz does end up becoming Ruth's redeemer. But all of that happens much later, and this is early in the story. He suddenly sees this new woman working in the field, and he approaches her, and he offers her nothing but kindness. Boaz doesn't have to do this. He does it because he has experienced God's love, and he wants to share it with others. He does it just because he's a giving kind of person. And this is hard for us to receive things from people. We live in a reciprocal culture. I scratch your back, you scratch mine is one of our phrases, right? We like to get something in return for what we have done. In fact, I have a relative that always asks this question when I do something for them. They say, how can I repay you? Do you have somebody in your family like that? Mm-hmm. We all know the person who also will not accept help from us if they feel like it might put them into debt of some sort, right? And I am using quotes because it's not an actual monetary debt, but they feel like they owe you in some way. Maybe another favor. But I do know that I love the times when I can give to a person knowing that there's no way that they can return anything to me. And that's been the kind of hospitality that I've received traveling abroad. There's no way that I could ever repay the kinds of gifts that I've received. I like receiving less when I'm not able to return. I will admit that. It is just so ingrained into us that we're a culture where we have to somehow give back if someone has given to us. But I will admit that my life has led me to get more and more used to it. One of the things I experience, for instance, is all of your generosity at Christmas time, and there is no way that I would be able to give back to all of you in the way that you give gifts to me. And in reality, I say this quite often, but I am aware of it, I live by your generosity. If you all up and decided to leave, as much as I could preach to an empty room, I would no longer be able to pay my bills. And so I live by you being generous. And there's no way that I could ever repay that. And I grew up in this way because my dad was a pastor as well. I remember at Christmas time there was a family that always gave us a ham. And there was another family that always gave us a tray of meats and cheese. And I don't know why I remember these things other than the fact that I love to eat. But again, this was generosity that we received so much that we could never return that generosity. And we all have to begin to learn that lesson. And we have to learn from Ruth, who takes Boaz's hospitality and receives it. And she knows that there's nothing that she can do in return, because, again, she is nothing in their culture. But she receives his hospitality. And that's all we can do sometimes. And we have to learn that lesson because we are God's people, and the reality is that that's how we receive from God. We cannot ever give back or return to God anything that would ever amount to what God has given us. It doesn't mean that we don't have things to return to God. We return praise, and we return in our actions that are pleasing to God. But we must never think that they will add up to amounting in what we have received. And so I do try to give back in ways that I can sometimes. I give small gifts to people. For my friends in other countries, I always come bearing something, some good products from Michigan, fudge, or cherries, things like that. But it'll never amount to what they have done for me. But that is who we are as God's people. We are stuck in the position of needing God's generosity. And while we can give back, we can never repay. And so we can learn from Ruth because she's in the exact same situation. But we also need to learn from Boaz, because he is the one who exhibits God's love in this story. And our theme for this year, I wanted to remind you on the first Sunday of the year, is about sharing God's love. It comes from our vision statement, joyfully reaching out to share God's love and faith in Jesus with everyone. And we're focusing each year on a piece of that phrase, and this year we're focusing on sharing God's love. Boaz shares God's love with Ruth. Again, not because he has to. He does end up becoming her redeemer, which is, again, a legal definition where he then does have a responsibility. But he is not her redeemer to begin with. He just is a relative who has experienced God's love and wants to share God's love with others. And he shares it with this foreigner who is nothing. And you can see the goodness in Boaz because, again, he's sharing with someone who isn't powerful or influential. We often do that, right? I strategically give gifts to people who I know may be able to return it, right? Or who might, again, with a I scratch your back, you scratch mine, might be able to benefit my life in some way. There is nothing for Boaz to gain in this relationship. And yet, like God, he cares for her fully. He says, go and pick food to eat. And if you're thirsty, go and drink water. And I'm going to give you work to do, which is important because, often without work, we don't have a real purpose in life. And again, Ruth has lost everything, her husband, her children. She really has no life. And so the beginning of that is to find something for her to do. So he offers her work to do. And then he says to her, if you need anything else, you come and find me. So he provides for her completely. And God provides for us completely. And again, God doesn't do it because we're powerful or influential or there's anything that can be gained from us. We're told in Scripture that God seems to do it for our love if we would be willing to return it. Boaz does it just because he has known God's love, and as a person who knows God's love, he understands that he is meant to share that with others. And we're called to do the same. And so I told Carrie that I was going to talk about random acts of kindness today, and she shared some really good examples. They can be small things, but we are meant to be people out in the world sharing God's love with the things that we do. And sometimes it can be very concrete, and it's clear that we're saying to the person, I'm doing this because God has loved me and I want to show love back to you. We might do that, as Charlie suggested, by offering them a second chance and saying, I'm going to give you forgiveness because I've experienced forgiveness from God. But there are other small things we do, like holding the door open from someone. I do think that that is an act that can show God's love to someone. But we may not have a moment to specifically speak to God's love right then. We do both small acts and larger ones, doing it all because it is who we have experienced God to be. But I also found myself thinking further on in the week about this phrase, random acts of kindness. Why do we use the term random? I mean, it is hopefully that we are looking out for chances to do good things at every possible opportunity. And in that sense, I love random acts of kindness. But I also want to encourage us to not have all of our acts of kindness be completely random. And so I would encourage you to find someone who you can share God's love with. We might try, rather than constantly doing random acts of kindness, we might seek to do unselfish acts of kindness. Because again, I talked about how we often do things thinking about the transactional nature and how we're going to maybe receive something later. We don't like to admit it, but I think we make more decisions based on that than we would admit. We might try Boaz and Ruth acts of kindness. And I include Ruth because you heard in Scripture today that part of what Boaz says is, when Ruth says, why are you being so kind? He says, because I've heard of how kind you are as well. So sometimes we might do kindness for people who have been kind as well. And not necessarily to us, right? They can be unselfish. We might see someone be kind to someone else, and we might be kind to them then and say, I saw how kind you were. That's what Boaz does. He says, I've seen how you've treated Naomi. You see, Naomi was in the exact same position as Ruth. She has lost everything, all of her children, all of her and her husband, and she has nothing. And in fact, she comes back to Israel. The word that people use to describe her is bitter. She's bitter. And yet at the end of the story, if you've read all of Ruth, what you find out is Ruth ends up having a child, and that ends up providing a new life for Naomi. The women end up saying she is no longer bitter because she has been redeemed. This word redeemed appears in Ruth a lot. We might do redemptive acts of kindness. Or I looked for something that might be the opposite of random, and I found the word thoughtful. We might do thoughtful acts of kindness. We might do godly acts of kindness. The kind that happen just because that is who God has made us to be. God gives because that is God's very nature, and as God's people, we are meant to be sharing God's love and being kind because that is who we are. We might practice Jesus' acts of kindness. Those are the kind that stretch us to go further than we normally would. I often hold doors open, but can I find a thoughtful way to share God's love with someone in a way that involves some sacrifice on my part? Because that's what Jesus would do. We have to do Jesus' acts of kindness because Jesus came and offered himself for us. And as I talked before about how God has done so much and given so much in a way that we could never repay to Jesus what he has done for us. In fact, we need to let go of that idea. This tendency we have to keep track of things and thinking, well, if I can just make the ledger add up right on the other side, then I can even things out. No, it's not possible. Just like Ruth will never be able to repay Boaz's kindness because he just is kind, because he's seen her kindness. We have seen God's kindness to us, and we become kind because of that. And we go and we share God's love with people extravagantly just because we have received extravagantly. It's how I try to live my life, because all of my life I have experienced these moments of generosity from you and from people across the ocean and from all avenues of my life. And I know, as much as I want to try, that I will never be able to repay them, but I can, as Carrie mentioned, pass them on or pay them forward, even in little ways. Not always randomly. That is good, though. I love that you might be on the lookout for a way you can randomly be kind, but I also want us in this year to to be thoughtfully, selflessly, godly, Jesus kind. Amen.